June 2012, Dungeness, England. A team from 4 organizations has just brought 46 short-haired bumblebee queens from southern Sweden and is releasing them onto English soil for the first time in 24 years. In 1988, this species was considered extinct here. The 46 queens have just woken from hibernation in a University of London lab, and they are flying for the first time over a homeland none of them has ever seen. Within a few weeks, Nicky Gammons will find the first worker bees on the meadows. That will mean one thing: the queens survived the night and founded colonies. But 5 kilometers from the release site and beyond, there is nothing. Outside the reserve, the landscape had killed this species before anyone had a chance to save it. So how did 46 queens become the beginning of something Britain had not seen in decades? And why is this a more complicated story than it looks? Nicky Gammons is an entomologist, project manager at the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and later a fellow of the Royal Entomological Society. She is the same woman who traveled to the Swedish county of Skane every year to collect queens from field burrows by hand, and then transported them to London in chilled containers, in a state of artificial hibernation, asleep. In the lab, they were gradually woken up. They were held in quarantine for 2 weeks, screened for parasites, and only then released onto the meadows. She does not romanticize the return of extinct species. She documents it. In her 10-year report, she recorded every season. How many queens were brought in, how many survived hibernation, how far from the release site workers were found, which flowers were blooming when the bees first emerged. Not simply that the bees came back, but specific numbers from specific transects on specific dates. But it did not begin with the report. It began with what she saw on the meadows at Dungeness and what was already almost gone. In 1945, the Second World War is over. Britain is economically in ruins. Food security has become a national priority. The government massively subsidized intensive farming, seeking more grain and more meat, and less land seen as unproductive. Wildflower meadows are treated as unproductive land. Over the next 70 years, Britain lost 97% of its wildflower meadows. That figure comes from the Bumblebee Conservation Trust, and it refers not to some niche ecosystem, but to ordinary grasslands with mixed wildflowers that once covered most of rural England. Imagine if 97% of the Great Plains prairies had been wiped out over a few decades. Not through drought and erosion, like the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, but deliberately, with tractors and pesticides in the name of maximum yield. That is exactly what happened in Britain, only with meadows and without any public reckoning. The short-haired bumblebee is a specialist. It cannot just feed on anything. It needs specific plants, clover, vetch, bellflowers, and it needs them in abundance, close together. As the meadows disappeared one by one, the population followed the same trajectory. Yorkshire, East Anglia, the Midlands, all gone. By the 1980s, the bee clung on in just a few places in the south, and finally, only here at Dungeness. There was the last confirmed sighting. Then, nothing. In 2000, the IUCN officially declared the species extinct in the wild in Britain. But the short-haired bumblebee is not the only lost species. There is also Cullum's bumblebee, last recorded in 1941 in Berkshire. For that species, there is no living population anywhere in the world. No New Zealand, no Sweden. It simply vanished. The short-haired bee only had a chance because 100 years earlier, someone had thought to ship it to the other side of the planet. But there was one detail that made this situation unusual. The short-haired bumblebee had not gone globally extinct. It still existed in Sweden, in the Baltic states. And here is where it gets strange. It existed in New Zealand. Between 1885 and 1906, Britain introduced 4 species of bumblebee to New Zealand to pollinate red clover. The short-haired bumblebee was one of the 4, and it survived there, though it remained rare, with small isolated populations on the South Island. When British scientists began planning the reintroduction in the mid-2000s, the first idea seemed logical. Bring the bee back from where it came from. Take queens from New Zealand, fly them back to Britain, and release them on their ancestral home. The skeptics had arguments, real ones. Start with genetics. New Zealand is an island, ecologically isolated. When a few dozen bumblebees crossed the ocean on a British ship in 1885, the entire gene pool of the species was reduced to those few individuals. After 120 years of isolation, the population could have become genetically uniform, and uniformity means vulnerability. One disease, one parasite, and there is no resistance. But even if genetics were fine, there was still climate. 120 years in New Zealand means 120 years of adaptation to a New Zealand winter. Mild, wet, short. The British winter is different. Colder, longer, unpredictable. Could queens that had never experienced it, whose mothers had never experienced it, survive hibernation in Kentish soil? And third, the quietest argument, but perhaps the most dangerous. Nobody knew what parasites and pathogens had accumulated in the New Zealand population over those generations. Introducing infected queens could destroy not just the program itself, it could wipe out the remaining rare British bumblebees that were barely hanging on. And here's the detail that explains why all these arguments sounded so confident. In 2009, none of the 4 organizations behind the project had a single documented precedent of a successful bumblebee reintroduction in Britain. They were making decisions about something that, for all of them, was still purely theoretical. The organizers heard all of it, and they decided to try anyway, with a full quarantine protocol and DNA screening. In 2009, the first queens from New Zealand arrived in Britain. The program failed. It failed quietly and completely. Some queens died in quarantine before any release at all. Those that survived and were released did not make it through their first British winter. The skeptics' second argument had been right. 120 years in a New Zealand climate had done its work. But worse than the queens dying was what the DNA analysis revealed. The genetic diversity of the New Zealand population was critically low. So low that even if the queens had survived, the long-term viability of the population would have remained in doubt. The first argument was confirmed too. Gammon sat with this data and understood New Zealand did not have what was needed. But she also understood something else. There was a place where the same bee was living, reproducing, and even expanding its range, where the winter was North European, where the population had never gone through island isolation. Sweden. The short-haired bumblebee in Scandinavia had not just survived. In the 1950s, it had been declared extinct in Norway, but then naturally, on its own, recolonized it from Sweden. That meant genetic health was there, cold climate adaptation was there, the capacity to spread was there. In 2011, Gammons traveled to the province of Skane in southern Sweden. They ran preliminary screening, collecting queens, testing for parasites and pathogens, comparing against known threats in Britain. The results were acceptable. But before Gammons had taken a single queen, a scandal erupted. Swedish conservationists learned of the plan through the press. Anneli Johansson, director of ecology for Skane County, stated publicly that if the British took 100 queens, Sweden could end up in the same position as Britain. Lars-Åke Jansson, a biologist at the Swedish Museum of Natural History, was more blunt. They're no longer rulers of the world, as they used to be, just going around taking whatever they wanted. Gammons began receiving threats on Twitter. One post read, "Stop this woman by any means necessary." She responded publicly and calmly. Skane has approximately 30,000 short-haired bumblebees. The team was taking less than 1% of 1%. The permit from Swedish authorities had been granted 18 months earlier. Skane County ultimately agreed as well. But the scandal itself says something more important than permits. When a species is so rare that removing 100 individuals from a population of 30,000 is perceived as a threat, that means the situation everywhere is worse than official reports suggest. Later in this video, we ask why even this did not solve the core problem. Every May, Gammons and a small team flew to Sweden. They searched for queens that had just emerged from hibernation and had not yet founded colonies. The window was a few weeks, no more. A queen that had already laid eggs was not suitable for transport. Finding them was not easy. The short-haired bumblebee nests underground in old field mouse or mole burrows, sometimes simply in dense grass. It does not build visible combs. It simply disappears into the ground and emerges with pollen on its legs. Volunteers and researchers crawled on their knees across the meadows of Skane, watching the flight paths, where it was going, where it returned from. When a queen was found, she was carefully collected, placed in an individual container, and chilled. Not frozen, but chilled into a state of artificial sleep. This way, she endured the flight and journey to London with minimal stress. Then 2 weeks of quarantine and tests. Only after that, Dungeness, Of every 100 queens selected, not all made it to release. In June 2012 at Dungeness, 46 queens were released when the container opened, but 2012 was cold and wet, not what bumblebees need at the start of the season. The queens survived, but the results were minimal. So the team did what all good scientific projects do. They tried again and again. Every year, around 100 queens from Sweden, 2 weeks of quarantine in London, and release at Dungeness. 2013 was warm, and workers appeared on the meadows around the reserve. Not queens, but workers. That meant one thing: queens had survived winter and founded colonies. The first short-haired bumblebee workers on British soil for the first time in a quarter of a century. Here's where the project gets more complicated than the press reports suggest. The team did not stop after the first successful colonies. They kept bringing queens every year, all the way to 2022. 10 years from Sweden. 13 years if you count from the first failed attempt. Why? Because a self-sustaining population is not the same as a few colonies. For true recovery, you need queens born here that have survived winter on their own, found mates, and founded new colonies without any outside help. And for that cycle to close without annual reinforcement, you need more than the right climate and a healthy gene pool. You need meadows, which do not exist. And here begins the real result, but it's not about the bumblebee. While Gammon spent years persuading Swedish farmers to give her queens and British farmers to sow clover and wildflowers, something else was happening. 850 hectares of wildflower meadows appeared where there had been none for decades, then 2,600 hectares, then 100 miles of road verges sown with mixed wildflowers. And in this changing landscape, other rare bumblebees began to appear. The ruderal bumblebee and brown-banded carter bee grew in number around Dungeness. Gammons puts it simply, "This year we found the ruderal where it hadn't been seen in 25 years. That's what keeps us going." The moss carter bee is stable where the project operates, but continues to decline beyond its edges. The short-haired bumblebee became the justification for restoring the meadows, and the meadows became home for everything else. Gammons writes about this directly. The wider benefits extended well beyond what we initially anticipated. Simply put, we came to save one bee, and we restored a fragment of landscape that dozens of species needed. The analogy is wolves returning to Yellowstone in 1995. They changed elk behavior. Elk stopped trampling riverbanks, vegetation recovered, banks stabilized, channels were restored. A trophic cascade. In Kent, something similar is happening, but quieter and slower. One small bee justified the restoration of thousands of hectares, and those hectares became an ecosystem. But there's a difference from Yellowstone that needs to be said out loud. The wolves in 1995 returned to a wild ecosystem and stayed there independently. The short-haired bumblebee in 2022 still required annual imports from Sweden because the British landscape beyond the reserve is still not restored enough for the population to close its own cycle. The skeptic's third argument about scalability turned out to be both right and wrong at the same time. Right in the sense that without ongoing external support, the population remains vulnerable. Wrong in that they did not foresee how the program itself would transform the surrounding landscape. When there are enough meadows, the need for imports decreases. But enough is not a 5-square-kilometer reserve. It is a connected network of flowering habitat across hundreds of kilometers. The reintroduction succeeded, but the recovery, not yet. Since 2022, the Reintroduction project has officially ended. In its place came the Bee Connected program, expanding the working area by another 40%, now into Sussex. The goal is no longer to bring the bee back. The goal is to make the landscape such that it can stay. But the question Gammons raises in her report remains unanswered. If the population requires continuous genetic reinforcement from mainland Europe, is it a returned species, or is it a managed species? And what is the difference for the landscape surrounding it? There are places in Britain where no program exists, where meadows are not being restored, where farmers are not sowing wildflowers, where volunteers are not counting insects. There, populations of rare bumblebees continue to decline, quietly, without reports of success or failure. 97% of the meadows are gone. The 3% that remain are scattered in fragments across the country. A bee cannot fly between isolated patches without a continuous chain of flowering habitat between them. Dungeness shows that recovery is possible, but it also shows what that costs 13 years, 4 organizations, hundreds of volunteers, thousands of hectares, and annual trips to Sweden. What would it take to launch a Dungeness somewhere that is not Dungeness? Gammons herself talks about what she would do differently. Not quarantine in London, but quarantine greenhouses right here in Kent. Imported queens would mate and raise their first generation on British soil. Only their offspring would be released into the wild. Less transport stress. Better odds of genuine adaptation. But that required money that was not there. There is no answer, and without an answer, Dungeness remains an exception, not a beginning.